Hello, everyone. Welcome to topic 8 for your course, Cognitive Psychology. Today, in this uh, presentation, we're going to look at everyday memories and memory errors. So, when most of us think of memory, we consider the context of our everyday experiences, like why we remember some things better than others, like our ability to remember an appointment, but sometimes we may forget our friend's birthday. Okay, so in this topic, we're going to cover a bit of that, like why it's easy to remember some things and forget other things that may be important to us that we think we should remember. So, how accurate is eyewitness testimony? Right? Many innocent people have been found guilty of a crime or spent some time in prison due to eyewitness testimony. So, in the United States, for example, approximately 200 people have been shown to be innocent through DNA testing, and more than 75% of them were found guilty on the basis of mistaken eyewitness identification. So you might assume that most jurors and judges would be knowledgeable about this, like the potential errors or problems on relying on eyewitness testimony. However, that assumption is somewhat wrong. Benton and colleagues in 2006 asked judges, jurors, and eyewitness experts 30 questions concerning eyewitness issues. And they actually found that judges disagreed with the experts on 60% of the issues, whereas jurors disagreed with experts on 87%, which is alarming. The issue is that eyewitness testimony can be distorted via confirmation bias. That is, the event memory is influenced by the observer's expectations or prejudices. And a study by Lindholm and Christensen found that participants' expectations of the likely ethnicity of the criminal affected their memory in identifying the perpetrator. So there are serious implications we see here from eyewitness testimonies being inaccurate or biased due to the individual's expectations. Okay, so later in the lecture, we're going to talk about eyewitness testimony again. But here, let's cover the first topic or first subsection, which is autobiographical memory. So, what is autobiographical memory? Well, these are memories related to our personal past, our experiences, and to people important to us. This relates to personally significant events and help us to identify and support personal goals. And it can extend back to several years. So, referring to our memories or experiences of childhood, adolescence, young adulthood. And it could also deal with complex memories, right? Given details about past events, so including how we felt, what actually happened, like the ceremony or the experience, where you were, where it happened, right? So it include a whole host of information. So there's some questions we could consider when we're thinking about autobiographical memory or just memory errors in general. So, what kinds of events from our lives people are more likely to remember? What are the properties of the memory system that make it both highly functional but prone to error? And then, why is eyewitness testimony often cited as a cause for wrongful convictions? And we'll try to answer some of those questions in this lecture. So, let's go back to autobiographical memory. So, as I mentioned before, autobiographical memories, I apologize, are multidimensional because it consists of spatial, emotional, and sensory components. For example, if someone's recalling the memory of like getting married or their wedding, it will include a whole host of information like images of the decoration, the color scheme, the ceremony. It would also include like knowledge about the venue, like general knowledge of what happened on that day, like who was present. Um, autobiograph- Autobiographical memories are multidimensional, as I mentioned before, and we tend to remember some events in our lives better than others. And these memories, like I said, will include a whole host of information. So visually, we'll know what the place or environment look like. Acoustically, we'll kind of have memories about things that we've said, music that was played. We will have feelings of taste. So, like, if you, again, go back to the example of someone recording a wedding, they recall like what food tastes like, and they will have appraisals for that. Any smells, any emotions, whether those emotions are positive or negative, and even spatial information, because we live in a three-dimensional environment. You'll have a sense of your awareness also. Now, Greenberg and Rubin found that patients who had lost their ability to recognize objects or to visualize objects because of damage to the visual areas of the cortex also experienced loss of autobiographical memory. This may have occurred because visual stimuli were not available to serve as retrieval cues for their memories. But even memories not based on visual information are lost by these patients. So apparently, visual experience plays a very important part in our autobiographical memory. And it would seem reasonable that for blind people, the auditory experience may take this role, right? It will assume the role of the visual component of visual information. Now, we could look at this experiment by Kubiza and colleagues, and they conducted a scanning study that illustrated the difference between autobiographical memory and laboratory memories. So, what they essentially did is measure the brain activation caused by two sets of stimulus photographs. One set that the subject had taken, and another set that had been taken by someone else. And we could see them in the diagram or the figure in the slide. Now, we refer to the photos taken by the subject or the participants as their own photos and the ones taken by someone else as the lab photos. Now, the findings of this study show that the brain scans it illustrated that their own photos and the lab photos activated many of the same brain structures, mainly those associated with episodic memory, such as the medial temporal lobe, as well as areas in the parietal cortex involved in processing scenes or the environment. In addition, persons' own photos, so the photos that they take, the photos that they took cause more activation in the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is associated with processing information about the self. And also, we saw activation in the hippocampus, which is involved in the recollection of memories. So, memories associated with mental time travel. Thus, from this, we could see that the pictures of a particular location that people took themselves elicited memories associated with taking the picture. Therefore, it kind of activated a more extensive network of brain areas and pictures of the exact location, but the pictures taken by someone else. Now, what does this tell us? Well, this suggests that the activation of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex reflects the richness of the experiencing autobiographical memories. Other studies also found that autobiographical, autobiographical memories can elicit emotions which activate other areas of the brain, specifically the amygdala, right? So this experiment essentially tells us that when we are reflecting on activity associated with this self, there's more complex and intense brain activation than images that are not referenced to ourselves, right? And specifically, the same areas in terms of looking at processing a scene, or we should refer to it as episodic memory, occurs, but once it related to the self, then we could see activation of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So, what determines which particular life events we remember years later? Well, we tend to remember personal milestones such as like graduating from, say, secondary school or from university, like receiving a marriage proposal, that tends to stand out. Um, other highly emotional events like surviving a car accident, anything that is significant in a person's life, we tend to remember it very well. Even if you use the example of somebody going out to dinner with someone for the first time, say on a first date, your memory of that first date is more likely to stand out if you end up having a long-term relationship with the person. But if it was just like a first date and it didn't go too bad or it wasn't too good either, that would be less memorable. Because you know, like never see the person again and it wasn't a very emotional event. There's no anchor for you to want to remember that memory. Okay, so that takes us to the concept of the reminiscence bump, which is essentially the idea that a large amount of memories persons that come from, sorry, a large amount of our memories comes from the years between 10 and 30, especially between 15 and 25. And this came from a study that showed that participants over the age of 40, when they're asked to recall events of their lives, they tend to reflect on those years. So between the ages of 10 to 30, especially 15 to 25. And there's some reasons why researchers believe that this is the case. So as we're talking about the reminiscence bump, and like we said as well, people tend to remember experiences from early adulthood. There are some explanations for this. So one is the self-image hypothesis. That is, memories are enhanced for events that occur as a person's self-image or their life identity is being formed. And if any one of you would have done developmental psychology, or you know there's some introduction to psychology, the sense of self and identity develops during the adolescent years, right? So that's where people try new things and take on challenges, trying to understand themselves. And they kind of expand their social networks. So that's a very significant stage in life where the person's self-image and life identity is being developed and formed. So, of course, one of the explanations being the self-image hypothesis is saying that because of that stage of your life where your personal self-image is being formed is very significant to you. So that's why you're more likely to remember those events or recall those events. The next explanation is the cognitive hypothesis. And this hypothesis suggests that the reminiscence bump occurs because of a rapid change that is followed by stability can cause stronger encoding of memories. And it applies to adolescents and young adulthood because during that stage, people experience significant changes in their lives. So, completing school or having long-term relationships, getting married, starting a career, right? Those are significant milestones and significant changes in the person's life. So that's why they're more likely to recall that stage when they're in their 40s. And the third explanation is the cultural life script hypothesis that suggests that um, events in your lives that fit the cultural life script in terms of anticipate to reach particular milestones as we develop, right? So during adolescent years, you attend secondary school, you complete school, and then you may go and find a job or you go on to university, you have a long-term relationship, you get married, you have children. So events in your life that fit that cultural script or expectations of what you should do are significant events, and that's why persons are more likely to recall those events. Right? Just to recall the explanations, like you said, the self-image hypothesis, memory is enhanced for events that occur as a person's self-image or life identity is being formed. That's why it's occurs during adolescent years and young adulthood years, because that's when identities develop. Again, with the cognitive hypothesis, encoding is actually better during this stage because of the rapid changes that persons experience that is then followed by some sort of stability. And the cultural life script hypothesis is that like each person has a personal life story, and they also have expectations or understanding of expected cultural events. So personal events are easier to recall when they fit the cultural life script. Okay. Now let's move on to memory for exceptional events. So emotions and memory are quite intertwined because emotions are often associated with special events, right? Emotions has also been linked to improved memory consolidation, which we know is a process that strengthens memory for an experience, and it takes place over minutes, hours, or hours after the experience. Now, although there's evidence linking emotions to better memory, there's also evidence that suggests that under certain conditions, emotions can actually impair our memory. For example, emotions can sometimes cause a focusing of attention on objects that are particularly important, like drawing attention away from other objects and so decreasing memory for those objects. One example of this is the phenomenon called weapons focus. So that's the tendency for persons to focus their attention on a weapon during a criminal incident, which we know is a typically high emotion eliciting situation. Right. Now, a special type of autobiographical memory is flashbulb memory. Now, flashbulb memories are vivid, long-lasting autobiographical memories of important, dramatic, or surprising events. So Brown and Kulik argue that these memories are unique in their longevity and accuracy, and that a special neural mechanism somewhat prints details of such events permanently into the person's memory system. So flashback memories typically contain important information about the informants, like who supplied the information, where the persons learned the information, the ongoing event, their emotional state, so how you felt about hearing about that event, the emotional state of others, so how other people reacted, and the consequences of the event, right? So we're just looking at some historic events for Trinidad and Tobago, and some of you may not have experienced like the first two, but a significant event for like an older person in Trinidad would be like the 1990 coup attempt, right? A lot of persons, older persons, will be able to recall that event, like where they were when it happened or when they saw it come across in the news, how they felt, how their family members may have felt at the time, what it might mean for the country, and even their behavior, the behavior of other persons at that point in time, right? So they may have a lot of feelings of fear, confusion, ambiguity, right? And oftentimes, if you talk to an adult who was, or an older person who may have been an adult or even a young adult at the time, they could recall oftentimes with detail exactly their experience at that point in time. Another significant time could be when, but more positive, we could say, is when the soccer warriors qualified for the World Cup, right? So the country's reaction at that point in time, persons could recall possibly where they were when it happened, or where they were when they watched the game, um, how they felt when we actually when the goal was scored and we know that we actually qualified, right? More recent could be when lockdown started due to COVID-19, right? So when the decision was made to like close off schools and business places and we were in quarantine, like that bit of information, people could most likely recall the experiences at that time and how they felt and the reactions of the people around them, what it had on them. Other significant events could be, and not related to Trinidad, could be like 9/11, for example. People may be able to recall that as a flashbulb memory. Now, flashbulb memories are not like a photograph memories because they could change and be modified over time. So Brown and Kulik's idea that flashback memories are like a photograph was based on the finding that people were able to describe in some detail what they were doing when they heard about this highly emotional events. So they had the example of like Kennedy's assassination, John F. Kennedy's and Martin Luther King's assassination. But the procedure that they used in that experiment was somewhat flawed because the subjects weren't asked until asked the subjects weren't asked what they remember until years after the events had actually occurred. So the problem with that methodology is that there's no way to determine whether the reported memories were accurate. The only way to verify accuracy is to compare the person's memory to what had happened or with memory reports collected immediately after the event. And in that experiment, that wasn't done. The issue here is that the technique that they used in terms of comparing later memories to memories collected immediately after the event is repeated recall. Unfortunately, they weren't able to do that in this experiment. Therefore, the idea that flashback memories are photographed may be a bit flawed, right? And we're going to explain why. Now, we have seen that emotions have been associated with enhanced memories, right? So, depending on how emotionally intense an event is, it oftentimes makes that memory more significant. So, encoding is more successful and persons are more likely to remember. But there are some situations in which emotions could actually decrease memory. Now, these two effects of emotions that are at the heart of the proposal by some researchers that suggest that emotions enhance the subjective sense of remembering and the vividness of the memory. Often persons are confident that their memory is accurate and they could experience a sense of reliving an event while at the same time causing a decrease in the memory, given an outline of the details of the actual experience. So oftentimes, because an event is so emotionally intense, people not only remember it, but they feel confident in their memory. And that level of confidence could sometimes distort or decrease the accuracy of the memory and remembering details of that event. Now, this experiment by Ramel and colleagues demonstrated the dual nature of emotions' effect on memory. So participants viewed 60 pictures, and from those 60 pictures, 30 were neutral, showing images of a landscape, and then 30 were negative, which were showing pictures of something like a car crash. Now, these pictures were framed in one of the four different colored borders, and you can see that on the screen, right? So red, green, yellow, or blue. Now, after showing them the pictures, 1 hour later, the participants viewed the original 60 pictures along with 60 new pictures. And for each picture, they did the following thing. So one, they asked participants to make a confidence rating between 1 to 6, where 1 indicated that they were sure they did not see the picture before, and 6 indicated that they were sure that they had seen the picture. Next, they made a remember no judgment, so remember / no judgment, in which remember meant that they remembered seeing the picture when it was initially presented, and then no meant that the picture is familiar, but they don't remember actually experiencing it earlier. Now, new meant that they had never seen the picture before, right? And then the third part of the experiment, for the pictures they rated as remember, they asked to indicate the color of the frame that had surrounded the picture. Right? Now, so the results, and you would see this experiment in your textbook, right? But the results shown on the table on the screen, and you'll see this in the textbook, indicate that participants were more likely to report remembering the emotionally negative pictures than the neutral pictures. Also, what they found is that 67% of the emotional pictures received a confidence rating of 6. That meaning that they're sure that they saw the picture. But only 51% of the neutral pictures received a confidence rating of 6. Now, despite giving a stronger remember response and a higher confidence in emotional pictures, participants were less likely to correctly name the color of the frame surrounding the emotional pictures they remembered, meaning that they were less likely to remember details of the scene. So results like this have led researchers to conclude that emotions can enhance our ability to remember that an event actually occurred and some general characteristics of the event, but it doesn't really enhance our memory for the details of what happened. So, for example, a person could clearly recollect 9/11 attack and any high emotion event, but may have forgotten the details related to it and how they first heard about the event, right? So that's significant. So when we discussed this earlier, we know we would have said that emotions are very important in enhancing memory, but there's a caveat to that, right? So we are able to remember at least at the level of being familiar, but remember that the event actually occurred. But the emotion aspect doesn't necessarily make us remember it or remember the details of that incident better. Now, the influence of television or videos influencing persons' memories are significant. So, an indication of any recording, like a TV show, a documentary, or a video, to capture people's memory is provided by a study by James Oust and colleagues in 2002, who approached people in a shopping center and asked them if they would be willing to participate in a study examining how well they can remember tragic events. Now, they did this in an English, or I should say British shopping center because the tragic event is significant to persons within that culture, right? So the target event involved Princess Diana and her companion, Dodi Fayed, whose death in a car crash in Paris in 1997 was widely covered by international news, but most of British television. Now, participants were asked to respond to the following statement. Have you seen the paparazzi video recording of the car crash in which Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Fayed lost their lives? So, of the 45 people who responded to this question, 20 reported having seen the film. Now, the issue is um, it was somewhat impossible because the film did not exist. So while the car crash was reported on TV, the crash itself was not shown. So there was extensive media coverage of the event, caused some people to remember something that is seen the film about the actual crash, but that didn't actually occur. So this is important to note here that persons may have experienced an event, and oftentimes for very tragic events that are popular, persons may receive different versions of a story, right? And this is not just limited to TV. Like even if an event happened among their friends or so forth, and everybody is recalling the event, everybody could have a different perspective or um, different details. The issue here is that it could actually lead to the revision of a person's flashback memory, right? So their version may incorporate information that may be false.